Hi there. My name is Matt Furness, and this is The Culture Hack, a video and podcast series that captures experiences and life lessons from those who know culture best. The goal? To help you to understand, design, and change your company culture. Thanks for tuning in. Hi, everybody, and welcome to The Culture Hack. It's Matt Furness here from Click Culture Consulting, and I'm joined today by Nelson Derry. So Nelson is the global head of culture, diversity, equity, and inclusion at ESOP. He's spent the last 15 years helping organizations to build healthy cultures. He's been recognized by the Financial Times as one of the top 30 future leaders in the UK for his contributions to culture and inclusion. He's a best-selling author and regular conference speaker. And with all that experience, I'm really looking forward to talking to him about all things company culture. So welcome, Nelson. Thanks for coming on.
Oh, what an intro, Matt. Thank you so much for having me. Jeez,
That's
I
okay.
feel very, very positive now.
Good. I'm slightly out of breath, but I'm glad that it gave you the intro that you deserve. So we'll be talking today about your experience shaping company culture, including the challenges you faced, what you did about them, the lessons that you learned. But just before that, we've spoken before, and you've got a
Mm,
fascinating story and background. So to start, it would be great if you could just share a little bit more about who is Nelson Derry.
yeah, amazing. And listen, thank you so much for having me. I've really enjoyed getting to know you over the last few weeks and months. And yeah, I really feel honored to be here. So thanks for having me. Who is Nelson? So I think it's probably best if I start from the beginning. So I grew up in Nairobi, in Kenya. I was there for the first 12, 13 years of my life. I had a bit of an well, it's unusual, but my upbringing was I was raised by a single mom, an incredible woman, super entrepreneurial and very, very, I want to say courageous, and not willing and willing to kind of make some bold moves. I wanted to kind of take you to the age of 6 years old, right? I have a younger brother. My mom's raising my brother and I by herself. We live in, I want to say, like the humble parts of Nairobi, if I can put it mildly. We lived in a single room apartment. If I'm honest with you, not not too dissimilar to the dimensions of this room that I'm in right now. So things were pretty tight, pretty squeezed up. But you know what I'd say, Matt, is perhaps some of the things that we missed out on, maybe the material things, were definitely outweighed by just all the things that I said earlier, right? The life lessons, the courage from my mom. So, you know, at 6 years old, my mom had managed to build up a little bit of savings, and she just, I guess she probably had this eureka moment where she's like, if my kids are going to emerge out of this particular situation financially, then there's going to need to be an investment in their education. And so she makes this big bold decision to say she's going to use all of her money to send me to my first year of a fee-paying school. And the funny thing, Matt, is like she didn't have the money for the second year, and she certainly didn't have a Scooby Doo how she was going to get the money for the third year. But in her mind, this was the way forward. This is the thing that needed to happen. And you can probably imagine the scene, right? A lot of her friends and family thought it was an incredibly reckless decision to make. But for her, it was very clear, and this was the vision, and she wanted to follow through on the vision. Anyway, she sits me down, she gets the brochure from the school that I'm going to, and I look through the brochure. I'm like, oh my gosh, this looks amazing. Like, there's all of these things I can do because I loved everything to be doing with being outside of the classroom. And she sat me down and she said, obviously you can see some great things that you're going to experience, but she said, I wanted to let you know something else, which is you're going to be walking an hour to the school, you're going to be walking an hour back. A lot of your friends are going to be driven in either by their chauffeurs or their parents, and obviously we didn't have a car. We couldn't afford a car at the time. She talked about you might get to visit their houses, and I ended up visiting their houses, man. Some of them were incredibly beautiful, right? And obviously, I knew where we were at. So I'm just sat here as a 6-year-old thinking, wow, this is a really motivational speech, Mum. I don't know if I want to go now. But she said something at the end which really stuck with me, and she talked about difference. And what she said is, I just want you to remember, Nelson, that your difference is and always will be your greatest strength. And it was, I didn't realize it at the time, but it was a very profound statement in the way that I show up these days as well. So anyway, went to school, and what I would say is the first, it was tough financially, really, really tough for my mom, for us to manage it. But, as I said, I loved when I was there, loved everything to be doing with outside of the classroom. That was my difference: sports, music, drama, art. And the teachers noticed that, and serendipity, right? The headmaster found out about our financial situation and actually made a decision which changed things a lot, which was to offer a almost full-term bursary for me to continue my studies there between the age of 6 and 13. And so you can just imagine this big, courageous vision that my mum had really coming to fruition and really getting that return on investment. But fast forwards to the age of 13, and it's kind of the time where you're thinking, how are we going to afford to send Nelson to secondary school? I just happened to play cricket that day. Little did I know that that day was going to change the trajectory of my life. So after the game, I don't know if you've played cricket before, Matt.
Yeah, I play a lot of cricket.
Play
Yeah.
a lot of cricket. Okay, cool.
Yeah,
So
yeah, yeah.
what did I do that day? I think I took 3 wickets, and I scored something like 41 runs. So the grand scheme of things, not amazing, but it was a pretty positive, positive day. Anyway, after the game, there was a parent, a dad from the rival school that we're playing against. He comes over to me and he says, congratulations, but you played a really great game. You played against my son. That's who my son is. Usual kind of chat, right? Nothing unusual. That's what parents would do. And then the next day, my coach calls me into the staff room, and here I'm thinking, oh my gosh, what did I do now? Because you're not often called into the staff room. And he said, listen, there's a gentleman that you were speaking to yesterday, and he reminded me who he was. He said, just so you know, he actually happens to be one of the wealthiest people in Kenya and also one of the wealthiest people in Africa. And we were telling him a little bit about you and a little bit about your story. And you won't believe this, Nelson, but he's offering to pay and sponsor for you to continue your studies in the UK. So I guess, just to be clear, this was a complete stranger. I'd never met this gentleman before, never, or his son. He had no connection to my school, no connection to my parents or my family, but his gift completely changed the trajectory of our lives. And I like to start and share this story because I think it really does inform a lot of the values that I have and this, I guess, underpinning mission around unlocking potential, democratizing opportunities for others, which probably has led to the work that I do today. But I also recognize that in some of the challenge and the struggle, I also had a lot of privilege. I had a privileged education, and so there's this quote that goes, if you're lucky enough to do well, then it's your responsibility to send the elevator back down. And I feel a real sense of responsibility when it comes to that. Um, Professionally, look, spent the first kind of decade plus in financial services, worked at Goldman Sachs in a variety of roles, client facing operations, change and strategy within the asset management business. A few years at other organizations such as the Bank of New York, leading their response to Brexit. And then I had this kind of my own eureka moment, which is I wanted to lead with my heart and I wanted to make the kind of impact that I wanted to make. And it started my transition into this thing we call people and culture. And I was lucky enough to work at a management consulting organization, helping them build out their organizational culture practice, and then that just led me to ESOP. So I've been with ESOP for coming up to 2.5 years. So I feel very, very grateful I get to do the work that I do. It's not easy, but I feel very grateful to have had the journey that I've had.
Awesome. Thank you so much for sharing all that
Mm,
background. And it makes a lot of sense in terms of how that's shaped sort of how you operate now and your interest in culture and inclusion.
mm,
Um, it sounds like a common thread in the stories that you told was people with privilege and power paying it forward and without obligations supporting people who needed help, basically. So
mm,
firstly, the headmaster, age 6, introducing a free bursary, and then when you were 13, the complete stranger paying for your education in another country. I'm really curious, why did he do it? In particular, the stranger. Why did he, if you even know, why did he do that?
I think I think that often, I feel very, very fortunate and I feel very, very lucky. But I also think sometimes you need to be putting yourself in a position where luck also finds you. And I also think that I think this started with kind of, I start with my mom, and I start with this comment that she made. She said, "Your difference is and always will be your greatest strength." And that showed up in what she encouraged me to do at school, right? Absolutely, there was this expectation to do your best when you're in the classroom, but also do your best outside of the classroom. I don't know how typical that was of the time that I was in when academia was really, really important. And that's probably what a lot of
Mm,
parents were encouraging their kids to do, right? But if you think about how I was parented differently, I was encouraged to do all of these other things. I think because I was encouraged to do all of those other things, that helped me to stand out compared to my, should I call them peers or classmates? Um, and there's something about repeatability, right? If you've got curiosity in something, if you've got a little bit of talent in something, you get better at it, right? And I just got better and better at sports. I got better and better at music and drama and all that kind of stuff. And I would say there was more than just my mom. There was more than just the teacher. There was my the coach that I mentioned. And I don't talk enough about him, but he would he would open up the music room because I'd arrive at school early because we could never afford to pay for piano lessons. But I just was like just curious about this thing called the piano, and he'd come in early into school. He'd open up the music room so that I could teach myself to play the piano for 20 minutes before school started. After a sports game, he knew that I was going to be walking home. So if we had a sports match, so he'd make the detour to go and drop me off before he dropped everyone else off back at school. And this is the kind of generosity that just happened to show up in my life. And it was that teacher that made the connection because he was the one who was talking to this stranger about me. And so I guess if you see what I'm saying, I feel like there's something about leaning into the opportunity to lean into my difference had this cascading and knock-on effect on the opportunities that then came and met met me. Now, why me? I mean, who knows? This is somebody who has done incredible things in the world, right? He didn't just do this just for me. He's built schools in Kenya. He's made investments in really philanthropic organizations. So he is just someone with a really good heart. And I just happen to be part of what will ultimately be his legacy, and hence that kind of feeling that I have this kind of responsibility to pay it forward as well. Sometimes it's in
mm.
small things as well.
It's amazing, and I love the little idiom that you used about the elevator. What was it?
Mm,
So if you're on the top, make sure you send it down, or something along those
yeah,
lines.
it's if you're lucky enough to be successful, if you're lucky enough to do well, then it's your responsibility to send the elevator back down. I
Mm,
think often it's quite easy to forget that. Um, there's this kind of like this saying that says, "Alone you go fast, but together you go far." And I think a lot of people forget the fact that there have been people along their journey that have
mm,
spoke up for them, that have championed them, that have sponsored them, that have invested in them. And I always
mm,
say, don't forget about those people that
mm.
changed your lives, right? And that doesn't mean in its binary sense only think about those people that helped you. It's bigger than that. It's what can you do to have a ripple effect for everyone else because those things happened for you.
Mm, mm,
I think it's very rare that someone ever becomes successful or does well or changes the world by themselves. It's very
yeah,
rare they did it by themselves. It's often they got help along the way.
yeah. And
Mm.
psychologists talk about this idea of what they call a fundamental attribution error, which is when
Mm.
you're successful, you attribute the causes of your success to yourself more often than if you were if you failed at something, we are more likely to attribute the causes of that success to the outside world. And so, what you're talking about actually is the idea that you need to combat that sort of default bias, as many people do, to acknowledge that you your successes are never wholly down to you, and neither are your failures. Both of them are a combination of what you put out into the world and your own traits and characteristics, and
Mm.
the world, the outside people, whether people help or don't help you, whether people are being nice or whether they're being arses to you, right?
Yes, 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 yes.
So
I love
that's
that.
what you, yeah.
Yeah.
Uh, Obviously, we are here to talk about culture, but what I'm picking up on is I imagine lots of these things that you're talking to me about around inclusion and belonging, I imagine they dictate your philosophy around what a healthy culture looks like.
Yeah, absolutely. Do you know what? I've been in healthy cultures. I've been in toxic cultures. I've been in healthy teams. I've been in unhealthy teams. Um, and I think it's you spend. It's cliche, but you spend so much of your working day in work and within this team and within this organization. um, I think there's a duty to yourself to be in an environment that lifts you up versus one that tears you down. um, you know so I got this message from a dear old friend at a previous organization, and it was just so needed at the time. And she said, I just wanted to let you know, Nelson, I see you and you're exactly where you're meant to be. Right. And that was really profound. And what it actually meant for me is, yeah, or at least what I kind of interpreted from that is, often it's not about what you're doing, it's sometimes about where you're doing it. It's not about what you're doing, it's where you're doing it. And you have to find an environment where you're able to truly express the highest and truest expression of yourself. um, I was reading this book by James Clear, Atomic Habits. Such a fantastic book, and he says something along the lines of one of the most effective things that you can do is to join a culture where the desired behavior is your normal behavior. Where the desired behavior is your normal behavior. And I think that's really, really profound when you're thinking about, or like when I think about culture, which is, culture is ultimately underpinned by the behaviors that are rewarded, the behaviors that are tolerated, etc. And it's often a very, very good barometer as to kind of, am I gonna thrive and be successful here, or um, am I gonna drown? And am I not going to
Mm,
be successful here?
mm. And it sounds like there is some personal responsibility in that. And I immediately go to a sport context where lots of sports people, I think of, for example, Mohamed Salah. If you're listening and you don't know who he is,
Mm,
he's a professional footballer. He spent years at Chelsea Football Club, wasn't doing particularly well, then went to Liverpool and was a completely different player. And for me, that showed that it's just that the playing style and the perhaps the culture and the environment around him wasn't right to suit him as a player. And I
mm,
think I see that a lot in organizations where it's not that somebody's not good, it's just that they're a round peg in a square hole. Is that the
that's
saying?
right. Yeah, yeah,
So there is some personal responsibility, I think, to make sure you're in a culture that really recognizes your strengths. I'm curious. So there is some personal responsibility, but I also imagine the organization plays a really important
mm,
role in creating the type of culture where differences are cherished,
yeah.
celebrated, valued, right?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. I think that's really, really, really important. I also just wanted to, I love the point that you made, and the example you gave around Salah, because I think often where this thing falls over, if there isn't actually clarity. So for me, culture is not just this kind of mystical like thing that's out there that you just feel and you just sense, right? Um, I think culture needs to be thought of really intentionally and by design, Because as human beings, the thing that creates a lot of anxiety is a lack of clarity. And so if there's a lack of clarity of what that culture actually is, and if an organization can't define what its culture is, then it adds such a layer of subjectivity. You're kind of like giving it's kind of like by chance whether or not you're going to thrive here or not. And I think you talked about kind of responsibility, and I do think there's a responsibility on organizations on being quite clear as to what their culture is. And we can talk more about that. I love what you said around kind of this sense of this sense of being seen and heard and being able to kind of be the best that you can. And I talk a lot about this, but one of the many things that I think organizations really need to be doing and thinking about is like how do you make it safe for people to do that. How do you create this? And it's some people call it speak up, but a lot of people use psychological safety, but I think it's this sense of how do you create this environment where people feel safe to be able to speak up, to be able to contribute their ideas, to be able to constructively challenge, to be able to admit mistakes, and to do all of those things, and it's not held against you.
Yeah, I think where we're at as a society in general, not always, is that I think most people recognize that psychological safety is important and
Mm,
sort of want to get there. I think pragmatically, still, people are struggling to do it. So I'd be really curious to hear from your perspective what are some really pragmatic, practical things that you, as a HR leader or as a manager, as a just any form of leader, what can you do or say to practically and
mm,
pragmatically build those feelings of safety?
that's a really good question. There's so many things I could talk to. I'll talk to a few. Susan Cain says there is no correlation between having the best ideas and being the best talker. And I think that's a really, really profound statement because, Matt, if you think about a team and a team being tasked with solving a problem, or a team being tasked with building some ideas so they can have a creativity and innovation and breakthroughs, what tends to happen is teams default to brainstorming, right? And if you think about the concept of brainstorming, it's very biased towards an extroverted thinker. And so tends to happen, and I'm generalizing a bit, is you find that 80% of the ideas are coming from 20% of the people in the room. So there's a huge opportunity cost. You're missing out on a huge percentage of ideas. Don't get me wrong. I'm not saying there's no relevance for brainstorming. Of course there is. But I also believe in balance. And the more inclusive thing to do is to think about perhaps the more introverted thinking style, who needs some time, who needs some space. And so imagine if you could practically, when you're in these situations and scenarios, balance brainstorming with writestorming. And writestorming, I don't know if I just made that term up, but I'm going to call it writestorming. But everyone in the meeting is invited to take the time to think and write down their idea or write down their contribution, but it doesn't stop there. And then you take the time to go through every single idea. It's amazing what happens, right? All of a sudden, the 80% of people who would have been excluded now feel included. They feel like, I was able to contribute my perspective and it got heard and it got discussed. I
Mm,
feel safer. I feel more included. And then the beauty of all of that is then decisions are being made based on the merit of the idea and not based on who it came from.
mm, mm,
And that is so powerful because it removes so many blind spots. And what happens to you as a team, you just become much more creative, you become much more innovative, and you really become a higher performing team. um, I think let's talk another example. A fast-paced business, or a kind of business where you're managing risk a lot, which I did in my first kind of decade or so in financial services. And someone comes to you with bad news, and often the immediate thing is, what happened, who was involved, why did that why did that happen? And that's what I call blame, right? And there's this whole thing of just taking the moment and actually, how might you replace blame and skepticism with curiosity, right? So maybe you replace the who did that, why did that happen with tell me more. Wow. Tell me more immediately creates this safe space to invite a conversation as opposed to a closed-ended question, right? It's opening up the conversation. Tell me more. How can we figure this out together? What do you think? Right? And it's these small practical ways of showing up as a colleague, as a leader, that creates a safer space. So you replace blame with curiosity, you replace skepticism with curiosity. Maybe I could keep going, but I think what's the other thing? The mirroring effect, right? So if you're the most senior person in a room or in a team, and you are consistently the first person to speak, without you even realizing, this might actually be coming from a place of positive intent, actually, right? You just want to just get the conversation going, right? And people feel, okay, now I can add and contribute. But what actually happens, and you'll know this far better than I will, but it creates what's known as the mirroring effect, where people will just gravitate and add and align to what you are saying, because they think that's the safest thing to do. And so you just lose out on the magic of what the true perspectives are. So those are probably, I could go on, but those are probably three really practical things that I would share.
I really like that, and I think I really like those ideas. What I would say about writestorming as well, you mentioned sort of extroversion versus introversion, but I think as
Mm,
much as that, it's good for breaking down the hierarchy.
mm,
My observation in meetings is if you just wrote down the percentage of people that spoke, and then you correlate it with the hierarchy, I would imagine that not always, but in a stereotypical meeting, the most senior person talks the most, the second most senior person talks the second most, and so on and so on. So, that right storming idea, I really like in terms of breaking down that tendency, um,
mm.
to give the more junior people an opportunity to share their perspective, which is often valid and equally as worthy, right?
I agree. I agree. It also, whether you like it or not, and you'll know this, you get conditioned by your environment. And so, in the example that you just described, if you're not able to share your perspective safely, what ultimately is going to happen is this thing we call homogenous teams. And the funny thing about homogenous teams, well, not so funny, but the interesting about homogenous teams is that it kind of gives this illusion of collaboration
Mm, mm,
because things feel easy, everyone's nodding their heads. You feel like you're a high performing team. But the thing is that easy does not translate into performance. Easy does not translate into performance. You need the safe space for that conflict and that
mm,
debate in an objective way to then make those innovations and those breakthroughs. And Patrick Lencioni in the Five Dysfunctions of a Team, he talks about, and I'm not going to get this right, but he talks about this 5 layers to really high performing teams. It's about trust. Um, what does he say? So he says there's trust, debate, commitment, accountability, and results. And so what he talks about is the reasons why most teams don't commit to a decision, and therefore don't feel this sense of accountability, is because there wasn't sufficient debate in the first place.
mm,
So you've got that whole situation of, yeah, we've come to this decision. Everyone good? Yeah. And then they go out of
mm,
the room and they don't act on that decision because they didn't believe in
mm,
it, right?
mm, mm,
And one of the main reasons is because there was a lack of trust and there was a lack of healthy debate leading up to that decision. So I always say lean into lean into that constructive challenge, because the medium to long term you'll see the return on investment.
mm. I think there's a myth there that psychological safety is easy, comfortable. It's about everybody nodding their heads to each other's views. It's actually the opposite. It
Mm,
requires discomfort and open debate and conflict.
mm,
Psychological safety isn't a soft thing, it's a hard thing.
complete,
Actually, to do it well.
completely. And I think it's really important because I think that businesses are at risk of not being relevant.
Mm. Tell me more
Um,
about that. What do you mean by that?
yeah, so I like to tell this story that comes from Matthew Said's Rebel Ideas book, and he talks about how I don't know if you've heard this one, but in 1958, there's this gentleman called David Bloom. He's a product development director, and he's working for this luggage company. And this was like Matt, the golden era of travel, right? Concorde, and it's a very exciting time. But during this exciting time, he notices something when he's at the airport. He notices that all of these customers who are about to go on this plane to their holiday destination, to get from A to B, they're like dragging this suitcase and sweating and pulling their bags to get from A to B. And it's far from this kind of luxurious kind of environment that this whole travel is meant to be. And he has this light bulb moment, and his light bulb moment is, imagine if you put wheels on the bottom of those luggage suitcases, right? And he's like, game changer. He's like, absolute game changer. And so he managed to get to slot at the board of his company, and he presents what is a very well researched, big thinking idea. And he gets to the end of his presentation thinking this is a slam dunk, and he's just met with what can only be described as a very, very lukewarm reception. And these executives are saying, why on earth would customers want something as ghastly as wheels on the bottom of luggages, right? Like, why are they? And if you think about them, like these executives, and you think about their position, they were in the best place to see innovation, to see the bigger picture. But what actually happened is they got trapped in their own paradigm. They got trapped in this paradigm of unwheeled luggage. It made it too difficult for them to step beyond this paradigm. And obviously, Matt, you're right. We're here decades later. We know who was on the right side of history. But this is what I mean about business, because businesses can become irrelevant, right? It's that whole sort of blockbuster versus
Mm.
Netflix thing, right? Is that if you aren't intentional about breaking homogeneity and creating an environment where you can have diverse and divergent perspectives, then just recognize you're going to be at a risk of not being relevant, right? And that's what I mean. I think that that's the example that I'd give around the importance of inclusion, diverse perspectives, divergent perspectives,
Mm.
and
Mm.
creating that safety to be able to unlock those things.
It's a great story, and I think what it makes me think of is how many other cases are there which are happening every day in organizations that simply aren't picked up on. um,
Mm, mm,
and all the different ideas that organizations are missing out on, but they don't even realize what those ideas could be leading to. I
mm.
think if I was being, I think one observation is, um, people listening might be saying that they agree conceptually, but some of this stuff's harder to do in practice than it is in theory, which is totally true. What I'd love to hear about is some things that you perhaps feel like you've got wrong over the years, or mistakes that you feel like you've made and really learnt from.
Yeah. I think I've made lots and lots and lots of mistakes. I used to think leadership was about title. I used to think leadership was about the ability to manage big organizations, the ability to lead with confidence and assertiveness, the ability to project, right? That's what leadership once meant to me. And I've since realized how wrong I was. And actually, leadership is something which is very, very different. And I think leadership is, and I don't think I was intentionally doing this, but perhaps this is how it may have come out, is leadership is not a weapon to be wielded for your own personal gain. Leadership is a gift to be shared in the service of others. And then I think as soon as I recognized and realized that, I had a complete unlock in terms of how I needed to show up. I needed to show up in a way that was bringing the best out of others. And I think all of this stuff that, I'm talking just purely from a leadership's perspective for now, but, you know, I think leadership is about caring. You don't need a title to lead. You just need to care, because I think people would rather follow a leader with a heart than one with a title. And all of these things which we're talking about is it's just about starting from a place of I care about you, and let's try and get to the best place. And so
Mm,
so I think that's certainly something that I've learned, because you see, for me, these topics can feel quite heady, and they can feel quite academic, right? But at the end of the day, it's important to just personalize it around what is it that I can do to show up,
mm,
right?
mm,
And if you just think about the collective of those things, like that's how you shift, that's how movements happen, that's how culture starts to shape up. So that's certainly something that I've learned around my personal accountability and my personal responsibility in contributing to the change that I want to see.
mm. It makes me think about a leadership development program that I was a part of years ago. And one of the
Mm,
questions that we asked people was, why should anybody be led by you?
mm,
And getting people to think about it purely objectively. Why would somebody want to follow you?
mm,
And as opposed to just because you've been promoted to head of or team leader or whatever it might be, so
mm,
that you can be clear on the value that you're providing for other people, because they
mm.
they will choose to follow you or not, right?
One
um
agree.
on the topic of leadership as well, I think that's probably a nice segue to your book, which
Mm,
is on the sort of new era of leadership. So talk
mm,
to me about sort of the top line sort of ideas or manifesto that you're putting forward in that book.
mm. There's something that you said earlier, which I really loved, and I'm gonna steal that and just reframe it slightly. So, um, I think there are fewer human desires than that feeling that you're accepted for who you are. That feeling that you feel a sense of belonging. And belonging is a very complex, multi-dimensional concept. But so I'm gonna oversimplify it a little bit just for the purpose of the question you just asked me, which is, I think it's about I feel seen, I feel heard, I feel recognized for my contributions, and I feel celebrated for the unique person that I am. Um, and the interesting thing is, once people feel that, it's incredible how you feel more motivated, you feel more engaged. And that then translates into I feel like I can perform more because I'm contributing more, right? There's a knock on effect of all those things. Now, as a leader, how do you unlock those things that I just described, right? And when I started to think about that, some of the vocabulary that came to my mind was, and this isn't new, but it was about being empathetic, listening with curiosity, leading with trust and purpose, creating inclusion, psychological safety, situational humility. And the time that I was writing the book, I was reflecting on it was during the time of COVID, and I was looking at the leaders around the world, and the ones who were head and shoulders above everyone else were the ones that were leading with that new vocabulary. So you think about Jacinda Ardern, and you think about just the challenges and the complex.
Donald Trump as well, right? Yeah.
Yeah, complete opposite, right? But
Yeah.
but 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 you see, and you look at her leadership style, and it was not command and control like it was historically. It was all about empathy. It was all about listening. It was all about doing this together. And those were the kind of the I guess the starting point for why I thought this was a really, really important book that I needed to write. And just a brief personal story is I remember when I first started my career in financial services, and I remember just very often being one of the few people of color in the room, right? And it's amazing how that showed up for me, which was I intentionally tried to make myself blend in as much as possible. I wanted to almost make myself invisible. And there was this particular department meeting that happened every week or every couple of weeks. And I would make my way to that meeting a good 5 to 10 minutes beforehand, and seat myself in the space where I could blend in as much as possible into the room and not be at the center of the conversation. And when I reflect back about my contributions, I would only add to what someone was saying because, and with confidence that actually it would be accepted, and 80%, I wouldn't get too much of a challenge. And this would go on for a few weeks, and then there was a new leader in the division, and he started to join these meetings, and I think he noticed me noticed me doing those things, and he hollered at me. He said, "Nelson." I was like, "Yeah." He said, "I've saved a seat next to me. Come and sit here." And I sheepishly walked around and sat down next to me. And it's really interesting, that because he saved that seat next to him every single meeting. And it's amazing what that did for me, right? Because all of a sudden I felt seen. All of a sudden I started to contribute more. I felt like my perspectives matter. And when things went well, I felt celebrated. And he was ahead of his time, but he was leading with this vocabulary that I'm talking about.
Mm,
And that just had a very, very profound impact in the kind of leader that I want to try and be one day. So yeah, I
mm.
wanted to just share that.
Fantastic, positive role model. And it
Mm,
sounds like he was able to get out of you what others hadn't by making you feel like your differences were cherished as opposed
absolutely.
to accepted. And so your mask or the covering that you were doing came down, and actually you A, felt better, B, probably contributed and improved your own performance and other people's performance, right? So it's a
Mm,
it's a win-win. So we've
absolutely.
spoken about leadership, we've spoken about culture.
Mm,
Let's combine them. And the question that I want to ask just before we wrap up is, what's a culture hack that you really love? So something that an action that leaders can take that is pretty easy to do, but will have a huge impact.
yeah. Um, I I'm going to take a component of that question and reinforce something, which is what you said at the end. What's the small thing? Because I think often people focus on the big transformational changes that needs to take place, when actually it is absolutely about the small thing that you can do. And we talked a little bit about the few small things you can do. Speaking last in meetings so that you don't create this mirroring effect is not a big thing. Inviting people to writestorm as well as brainstorm is not a big thing. It's
Mm,
a small thing. But one thing that I'll say about small things is, when you repeat those small things, you get this amazing thing we call compounding. Right? We get this amazing thing we call compounding. And the compounding effect of these small, tiny behaviors is they then become habits. And then the compounding effect of these habits being done day to day, every day, they then become norms. Those norms become culture. That's how culture transformation happens. I think culture transformation is usually born from the small changes, the small behaviors, the small moments that are repeated. The only other dimension that I'd add is it's the things that are rewarded as well. So if those things are rewarded within an organization and they're embedded, that's when the that's when the magic of compounding actually takes place. So that's what I'd say. I'd say, um, try to focus on the small things as a leader, do them
mm,
consistently, and you'll then start to see the ripple effects. And your role as a leader is a cultural steward of the organization. And so what you do gets amplified. There's a higher degree of accountability on you as a leader. And leaders should never forget that. And
mm,
sweat the small stuff, right? The
mm,
small
mm.
things really, really make an impact.
It's made me think about this leader that I worked with once. Let's call her Jane, and
Mm,
she openly supported lots of initiatives around diversity and inclusion. At the bottom of her email it said, "I support inclusion," with a rainbow flag. But then in meetings she would go on her phone when other people were talking. She would speak over people.
mm,
When junior people spoke, she would say, "I completely disagree." She would
mm,
ignore people. How she sat, how she faced certain people but not others, all created actually a very non-inclusive environment.
mm,
And it's not that the things she was doing outside meetings weren't important. but they're almost irrelevant if you're not actually showing up in those small moments every day.
Mm,
It
mm,
all also made me think about a piece of work that I was working on with a client around their values, their behaviors, and their competencies. And the competency level, we were talking about what a senior leader needs to do to create an inclusive environment. And other competencies are writing things like, you need, as a leader, you need to create a listening culture. And it's sort of like, yeah, you do, but you also, how many senior leaders do you work with that actually give 100% of their focus and in a conversation? They don't. And by
mm,
saying you need to create this culture, it almost makes it really hard for people to sort of grapple with. Whereas if you just say to senior leaders, look, every conversation you're in, I want you to give 100% of attention to the junior person when they talk and to engage, that will have a much bigger effect than sort of making it this grandiose thing. It's about the little
completely
everyday
agree.
moments.
Completely
um
agree. And there's I think what is heavily underestimated is it happens with intent and by design and not by chance. Because
mm,
some of the things that you were just describing, your previous manager or leader, are habits that they had.
mm,
And so to undo habits, you have to work at undoing those habits. And I think a big part of it is actually holding the mirror to yourself. And that's a really hard thing to do. To just, I would imagine if that leader said to you, what can I do differently?
mm,
Like really invited that, what can I do differently? And then all of a sudden be open to listen to what's coming back. You might say, well, maybe in team meetings, perhaps you can do this,
mm,
right?
yeah.
And that's where leadership starts. It's the fact that they recognize that leadership is not an end date, it's an ever growing evolution. If you're okay with that, and you're okay with being having a growth mindset, my gosh, the world is your oyster in terms of the impact that you can have.
Absolutely. And I think if she was to do that, she might have to ask it multiple times, because people might
Sure,
go, hold on, are you just doing this for an ego boost,
sure,
or do you actually want? It's almost like repeatedly asking that very simple question,
sure.
and then actually acting on it. So when
Mm,
people see that, oh, they actually are interested in what I think about them,
mm,
and have actually changed, then they'll come to you with more of their opinions and more of their sort of insight. But it requires that genuine role modeling. Anyway,
mm.
we could talk about this all day, and I'm really conscious of your time and the listeners' time. So, just before we wrap up, Nelson, do you have any final reflections on our conversation, or anything else that you'd like to share?
No, I think it's for me, I've really enjoyed this conversation because the more you engage in this kind of conversation, the more you reflect. And I just encourage listeners within their teams to table what does psychological safety mean within our teams, table what does inclusion mean to us, table how can we think about ensuring that we are inviting more diverse and divergent perspectives. I think we talk about the small things, and I think sometimes it's just about actually having the conversations to open up
Mm,
people's minds, because I certainly learn so much when I do things like this
mm,
and talk about these topics with the teams that I'm in. It makes such a big difference. So that's just maybe something that I just add, which is to really lean into the conversation.
absolutely, not
Yeah.
being scared of it.
Mm.
Awesome. Thank you so much. And just a huge thank you from me for sharing, for holding the time, for sharing your time and your experiences. I really do appreciate it. Thank you, Nelson. And if anybody wants to contact you with questions or anything like that, what's the best way to do so?
Yeah, LinkedIn's probably the best way. I'm relatively active on LinkedIn, so love to hear from new people, from different people. Love to learn from the community and their perspective. So
Awesome.
Nelson Derry is a great place on LinkedIn is a good place to start.
Awesome. Sounds good.
Yeah,
Thank you, Nelson.
brilliant.
So I think that's probably all we have time for. The only final thing I think worth saying is, if you like this episode, please do listen to our other episodes for more first-hand experiences and lessons on all things culture. Otherwise, that's all for today. Thanks so much for tuning in. Thank you, Nelson. Go well, everybody.